We go.
Welcome to our podcast. I'm Mary Abazia, and of course, is Tom Spitali and Sean Wellham. And we have been looking at storytelling. There's just so much to discuss about it because when companies get it right, it really makes a difference. We see even when they're doing their analysis, they start to say, I have to tell a story. So how are the key elements coming together? And then when they communicate it, if they do it right, they usually are a lot more convincing internally if they're trying to get budget or support, and externally, they're typically it's more the salespeople that are telling the story. They're more effective with their customers. So we have seen some things that work really well and things that don't work well. So we want to share more about that right now. So Tom, will you take it next,
Yeah, I
please?
want to, so we don't bury the lead here, right? I'm going to talk about what I think I've seen is the most powerful secret to telling storytelling to clients. And we have to say we learned this from one of our clients and we heard it, we checked it out, we tested it, and we said, this is brilliant. Here it is. When you're crafting a story that you're telling to clients, not only should your company and your product not be the hero, the client should be the hero, which we talked about in our last podcast, but you should not even in the story mention your product by name. Let that one sit with you for a little bit. But what we have found, well, Mary, Mary, you've experienced this with me, so I'm going to rather than me just monologuing here, why don't you talk a little bit about what you've seen that works about that?
Yeah, and we've seen it in really technical businesses. I think it's very interesting when you watch somebody that's technically trained try it. And it it worked very, very well. They were talking about, some high tech equipment. And but they just first started with there was this customer and they had this particular problem, and they tried this and it didn't work, and then they tried this and it didn't work, and they were very frustrated, and then finally they tried this new technology, and it seemed but they did it in a way that the hero was not the product. They never mentioned the company or the actual product, just more the approach of it. And it was really remarkable that when they tried it actually out in the field afterwards, it worked very well, but it's very hard to do because it's totally against the grain.
It is, and why does something like that work? Well, first of all, if you're trying to tell a story and ultimately your goal is to sell your company's products or services and you're asked to not mention it, it's really hard to do. But what does that force you to do? It forces you to weave a story of a solution. It forces you to weave a story that even before you talk about the solution, where you paint a picture of the hero, who is the client, and their problems and their frustrations. Again, not in technical terms, but in terms of what they're trying to solve, how they've tried to solve it in the past, how those problems have had, you know, incomplete or unsatisfactory conclusions in the past, and then how somebody found something that really, really worked well for them, and you haven't even mentioned your product. And I guess what we're finding is that the client says to you something that's very powerful. Tell me about that solution, which is really kind of, in sales, it's a little bit of a psychological game. And if you can get a client to actually ask you to tell them about their product or service because the story has been so powerful that you've made them want that, it's a really great place to be in a sales situation. Sean, what are your thoughts about all of that?
Yeah, I think, the key is in storytelling generally, you want relatability, don't you? You want to, well, I mean, in classic storytelling, you also want antagonists and people that you can love to hate. But of course, that's not necessarily transferable when we're trying to tell a more positive hero's journey sort of business story. So I think relatability is the key. And we want your customer, your prospect, your potential customer to relate very closely with whatever issue is being solved, whatever tension is being released, and whatever goals are being achieved. And it's almost like putting yourself into their shoes when you read something. And the more you relate, the more you see yourself in that story. And the more you see yourself in it, the more then whatever the solution is becomes applicable to you. So I think it's that classic relatability element of storytelling generally. You've got to feel that it's about you or someone like you, or at least something you can believe. And that's another aspect. It's relatable. It has to be believable as well. In storytelling, if you have a crazy, a sci-fi or a horror story, then you have what they call suspension of disbelief. You want the reader to suspend their disbelief and enjoy the ride, then pretend that time travel is possible or what have you. But of course, in more realistic stories, you can't have that. You've got to have credibility and believability. And that comes back from demonstrating an understanding of their situation. If you try and craft a problem that was solved that they don't see as realistic in their world, then it becomes a fantasy story rather than a realistic one. So those are the two things that I think tie it together: is the relatability of the character and the believability of the challenge they're facing.
I I like it. I like the idea of about believability, and a more subtle point below the surface about believability is something happens to a client when they think they're hearing a commercial versus a story. And when you talk about your products or services, it switches from the story to a commercial. Now I'm being sold to. And I think that that is a subtle point about believability, is that's why it works. It keeps them in a certain mode, a mind frame that you want them to be in. And I think that's why that works. And I think it's been one of the most, it's one of the hardest things to do. But I think if you can, as a marketeer, can contribute to that and help, your commercial team accomplish telling a powerful story that leaves it to the client at the end to say, all right, I want to hear more about that. I mean, I think that you're winning if that
Yeah.
happens. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
there's a
I think
subtlety to it, isn't
uh,
I was saying there's a subtlety to it in terms of finding that particular spot where you get that sweet spot between, because obviously we're not here just to entertain. There is a purpose, and even though storytelling should not classically, and this is a lesson we've learned, include the product front and center, certainly not as the main character or the hero of the story. But there's another aspect that if it was completely abstract and didn't relate back to something that you could help solve, then we become entertainers and authors. And we're not. We're marketeers and business people. So there's a very narrow window where you can achieve this. It's basically not easy, is what I'm saying, Tom. It's hard to tell that story that's not so far away from a product that they can't tie it back, but is also not switching the brain into what I'm being sold to. This is an infomercial, and
yeah.
it's difficult.
Yeah, I'm going to bring up two other things. So let's say that you have your story and you think it's pretty good. I do think you need to vet it and test it. And AI is a really good thing to have put your story through it and tell AI you are a potential customer. And as a customer, as you listen to this, watch out for these things. Am I being too critical of competitors? Am I whatever it is that are really important points? Make sure that you use AI in that way to just really be critical of what you're doing and that you're hitting the important points that you need to make with a customer. And then the other thing is the reality of going in front of some real customers and talking to them and sharing that story and seeing if it resonates with them, road test it or do a pilot on it. And it doesn't matter if you do that first or second, but I think both of those are really important points in building a good story.
Mary, if I could add to that, I mean, I think what happens too when you start to build a story in this way and have the discipline of, I'm going to create an entire story presentation without mentioning my product or service explicitly. we see that it has the impact of really actually helping refine your strategy. You start to see, oh my gosh, is this story strong enough and compelling enough? If not, why not? Am I working on the wrong unmet needs here? And the other thing I want to say is it also has the impact almost like a war game in terms of practicing that particular story. Mary, you talked about AI can be sort of like help you war game that yourself, but I mean, there's nothing like getting especially in a new product launch, like trying to create a presentation, a storytelling presentation that you do in front of your own friendly but critical-eyed colleagues so that you can figure out, again, is the story compelling enough that we can carry this off and we have a really good chance that at the end of it, the client's going to say, wow, that's pretty cool. What is the product? What is it? Tell me more about this. Because again, that's just such a powerful place to be in a commercial setting.
Yeah, yeah. So how do you make it practical for the salespeople to actually adopt it?
Well, that's we try not to be too commercial in our podcast, but I mean, I think that most of the times when we talk to people about the 5 or 6 frames that we think go into the story arc, right? That you start with, well, who's the client, and oftentimes that's the target segment, right? And how do you build that relatability and believability that Sean mentioned earlier? You start to get into the second and third frames where you paint this picture of a really, frustrated, semi to really frustrated customer, and then you start to weave in the later frames um, what their life looks like when they find the solution. I mean, it's something that is really hard to refute for the salespeople to say, hey, that makes sense, right? That's how salespeople are humans. They've grown up hearing stories, and their stories that they grew up listening to have the same arc, right? And so I think if you can, as we always talk about, if you can have them to participate in the story building process, bring to them a reasonable framework that gets them started, that makes perfect sense to them, ultimately I think you do get that buy-in. Not anything more complicated than that. Does
Yeah,
that
I
sound
got a
complicated?
slightly different take in terms of the salespeople, because if the story is meant to be a gentler way of enticing people to understand maybe issues they may face and solutions, to be inspired, to feel some emotion, to feel maybe some fear or some happiness or whatever it is, I think salespeople's job has always been to get to the deal. I'm not saying you walk in and say, here's the product, here's the price, do you want to shake on it? But they're always more transaction focused. They have to be, otherwise they lose effectiveness. And I think as long as they're part of that creation of the story arc and they understand the narrative, they can use the same issues in the story, but framed in a different way. I've been sold to lots, and the few people that have really impressed me stick with me. One in particular was asking me questions. And what is important about this? And then what happens if that's not hit? And what's the consequence of that? Then what would your boss think? Or what would the business do? And you're being dragged down this chain of consequences to obviously magnify the problem so he can sell me a solution. But I just thought to myself, at some point, we can't, the storytelling doesn't go all the way through to the point of contact with the customer, maybe. Sometimes your salespeople have to then use that mood that's been created to then navigate through to closing a deal. Otherwise, we maybe lose the sharp edge. Not universally, but I would suggest that salespeople need to be aware so they can, and salespeople are natural storytellers anyway, the good ones. It's just making sure they're telling the same story, I would suggest.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, Sean, is that some of the clients that hire us to help with their storytelling, the biggest thing they said is we have salespeople all saying different things, and we want them to have a consistent message, and we want the message to be compelling, of course. So having a story that all of the salespeople adopt to, and it has to change based on which segment, but it doesn't have to change based on which salesperson it is. The good salespeople should help make it so that it's repeatable across all of the sales force. So that's a big thing.
And Mary,
And
I
also,
think
for just on that point, the final point, it also feeds back. It's a loop, isn't it? Because if you craft a story in a workshop and you say, "This is our story. This is the issue. This is the resolution," and then you want salespeople contributing to that, but maybe another salesperson has a great story where they sell a different problem that crops up and a solution. We think we hadn't thought of that, and we bring that in. So it should be continually sort of feeding off all of the inputs, whether that's salespeople that are successful. Let's find out what hooks they're using and weave that into our story. And those salespeople that need help say, "Here's the story we've collected. Use some of these." It should be a continuous process of refinement because some people will have their own stories, and we need to make sure they're captured.
And of course, the world being what it is how often, and we're not suggesting that you're going to be able to repeat your story verbatim with every client, that they're going to just sit there and listen to you as you kind of go through the entire arc. I think the idea is, though, if you can get really good at articulating the story internally in a safe environment where you start to get a sense for that arc. Salespeople have to be able to kind of modify that and fit that to the circumstances, but it ends up being much more powerful. We've seen, and so that's my other point. First point being, it's got to be modified for the circumstances, and I think that's the point you guys are making. But the second thing is, all you really need to do is a pilot. Like get some of the salespeople to help craft the story, and then have them utilize it in these ways, right? To match reality, because nothing works in sales unless it improves the closing environment. And that's what this does. It just creates such a compelling closing environment, because now, instead of you trying to have to, do whatever technique to get the client to get their objections out, et cetera, you now have the client looking at you and saying, "Tell me about this. Tell me a little bit more about this, this solution." And it balances out the power in the selling situation to the point where it's easier to close. And nobody should take our word for it. I think they should try it and they should test it. But those that are doing it are finding a lot of success.
Sure.
Yeah. Yeah. This is great. We hope that you try this, and we really appreciate it if you send us any messages where you tried it and it worked, or you tried it and you're still trying to figure it out. So we're here for you guys. Good luck.